Welcome to Medi-Sagas, Tales in Medicine. This is Liam, your narrator for these incredible stories that were researched and written by physician and author, Dr. Rod Tanchanco. Prepare to be captivated by tales of perseverance, serendipity, medical misadventures, and the endless quest to conquer diseases. If you love history and true medical drama, then you're in the right place. Thank you for listening. Canada, 1922. The wards at Toronto General Hospital housed a collection of living skeletons cursed with the so-called pissing disease. Their breaths filled the air with the aroma of over-ripened, fermenting apples. Among the emaciated patients was Leonard Thompson, a 13-year-old boy who was diagnosed with diabetes just a few years before and had worsened to near death. He was not expected to survive. Diabetes has been known since ancient times. It was considered rare back then. Those unfortunates who suffer from it were cursed with an unquenchable thirst and an almost constant urge to urinate. The word diabetes came from the Greek word diabeinin, which meant to run through. It also referred to a pipe or a siphon. Urine seemed, to run through, someone who had diabetes, as if the person were a siphon gushing fluid endlessly. That word and the earliest description of the disease are widely attributed to the 2nd century Greek physician, Aretius of Cappadocia. He described the symptoms quite vividly.
Diabetes is a remarkable affliction not very frequent among men. The course is the common one, namely the kidneys and the bladder. For the patients never stop making water, but the flow is incessant, as if from the opening of aqueducts. The nature of the disease then is chronic, and it takes a long period to form, but the patient is short-lived if the constitution of the disease be completely established, for the melting is rapid, the death speedy. Moreover, life is disgusting and painful, thirst unquenchable, excessive drinking, which, however, is disproportionate to the large quantity of urine, for more urine is passed, and one cannot stop them either from drinking or making water. They survive not for long, for they pass urine with pain, and the emaciation is dreadful, nor does any great portion of the drink get into the system, and many parts of the flesh pass out along with the urine.
Given the severe degree of weight loss as diabetics wasted away, it's understandable why early medical practitioners, even up to the mid-19th and early 20th century, attacked the disease with large quantities of food, particularly carbohydrates or sugar. The resulting deaths from bombarding diabetics with sugar was what likely led to a radical change in the treatment approach. In fact, the new approach went completely the opposite way. Instead of feeding emaciated diabetics, they were put on starvation diets. The most prominent champion of this concept during the early 1900s was Dr. Frederick Madison Allen. After studying diabetes during a 3-year fellowship at Harvard Medical School, he published, with his father's funding, a massive 1,179-page tome titled Glycosuria and Diabetes. Allen's solution was to subject patients to severe caloric restriction, often under strict supervision in the hospital. And by caloric restriction, he meant cutting down on any source of calories, not just sugars or carbohydrates. Protein and fats were drastically reduced as well. It's no surprise that patients found the starvation diet very difficult, especially since they were already hungry, thirsty, and wasting away in the first place. Critics of the treatment raised ethical concerns. If the patients did not die of diabetes, they certainly could, and sometimes did, die of starvation. Wasn't starvation therapy merely replacing one fatal disease with another? And many of those who survived were miserable. Was it right to prolong, even worsen, the suffering of those who had no hope for cure? Leonard Thompson had been on the Allen therapy when he was admitted to Toronto General Hospital's Ward H on December 2, 1921. His ordeal began 2.5 years before, when he started to wet his bed at night. The admission record documented the rest of his early history.
Perfectly well up until 2.5 years ago, when he began to wet the bed at night. This habit or trouble gradually increased so that he went to see a doctor who was unable to find out the cause of the trouble for 1 month when a diagnosis of diabetes was made. Prior to this, he had noticed nothing, went to school, worked hard, and never tired or felt himself losing any strength. Always had a good appetite, was put on a diet, and has kept the diet to date with some exceptions when he would eat candies. Has been losing weight gradually, night frequency for 2 years, day frequency 2 years, always ate a lot of candies and sweet material as a child.
Leonard weighed 65 pounds, a tired, living shell with falling hair and a bloated abdomen. He was bedridden most of the time, and his doctors tried to control his diabetes with a 450-calorie-a-day diet, the equivalent of approximately 5 tablespoons of peanut butter a day. He was lethargic with breath smelling of acetone, clear signs of the serious complication of diabetes called acidosis. Leonard was not expected to last much longer. His physician, Dr. Walter Campbell, told the boy's father that they could try an experimental treatment that researchers at the University of Toronto were testing. Having no other choice, Leonard's father agreed. Those researchers were, of course, Charles Best, Frederick Banting, J.J.R. Macleod, and J.B. Collip. Over the past several months, they had successfully produced extracts from animal pancreas that, based on their experiments, had a promising effect on diabetes. But before we go on with Leonard's story, a quick summary about diabetes. It begins in the pancreas, the organ that for a long time was already known to be responsible for making digestive enzymes. Those enzymes are produced by cells in the pancreas and secreted through ducts into the intestinal tract to break down food. It turned out that the pancreas also has another type of cell, but its purpose was a mystery. It was in 1869 when Paul Langerhans, a 22-year-old medical student at the University of Berlin, discovered these strange cells. Peering through the microscope, he noticed cell clusters that were distinct from the others. Those cell clusters are now known appropriately enough as the islets of Langerhans. We also know now that those islets secrete insulin, the hormone that regulates sugar or carbohydrate metabolism. Without insulin, the body cannot use this basic fuel and the sugars. Glucose builds up in the bloodstream, unable to be used by the cells. Imagine insulin as the key that opens the door so glucose can enter the cells and be burned as fuel, so to speak. Without it, the cells are starved of energy. The expression, "water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink," is a close analogy. Imagine the cells of the body adrift in a sea of inaccessible sugar. The sugar levels build up in the blood and eventually spill out into the urine. The result is constant urination, thirst, hunger, weakness, weight loss. The body tries to create fuel from other sources, so it starts to break down fat and muscle tissue. As a result, stuff called ketone acids are produced, resulting in the distinct breath and acidosis. Before 1921, no one had yet isolated insulin from the pancreas, and not for lack of trying. Researchers had suspected for decades that the pancreas was somehow involved in diabetes, but isolating the responsible substance proved elusive. Some experts even thought it was impossible. There was no solid proof that the islets of Langerhans were even involved. Then one night in November 1920, Fred Banting thought he had an idea on how to find out. He was not a diabetes expert. He had never treated any patients with diabetes. He probably only possessed some basic knowledge of carbohydrate metabolism. He was not a well-known researcher. He was a surgeon in a struggling private practice and doing some teaching at the Western University in London. That November night, he was preparing a lecture when he read an article about the suspected relationship between the islets of Langerhans and diabetes. The article described a rare case where the pancreatic ducts, those tubes the digestive juices flow through on their way to the stomach, was completely blocked by stones. This blockage caused the cells that produce digestive juices to die, but left the islets of Langerhans intact. Why did this catch Banting's attention? Well, at that time, a major stumbling block to isolating any secretion from those mysterious islets of Langerhans was the fact that the other, more numerous cells called acinar cells produced digestive juices that probably destroyed the islet secretion when researchers tried to extract it from dissected pancreatic tissue. The article gave Banting an idea on how to harvest the islet of Langerhans cells intact, along with whatever secretions they hide. Banting recalled how the idea came to him.
The idea presented itself to me that since the acinous but not the insular tissue degenerates after the pancreatic ducts are tied, by this means an extract of the islet tissue might be obtained, without the destroying influence of the pancreatic juice. The idea above mentioned occurred to me about 2 a.m.
In essence, his plan was to conduct animal experiments where he would tie off the pancreatic ducts, wait for the acinar cells to die off, then surgically remove the pancreas and extract the secretions from the remaining islet cells. He brought his idea to the physiology professor at Western University, and eventually ended up in Toronto to meet with Professor J.J.R. Macleod, who was the eminent physiology professor at the University of Toronto and a recognized expert on carbohydrate metabolism. Macleod was not convinced. Banting remembered their hour-long encounter.
To my disappointment, he did not seem at all interested, and put me off by saying that many men had worked for years in well-equipped laboratories and had not proved that there was even an internal secretion of the pancreas.
Banting repeated his theory and plan.
He sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for some time.
And then Banting recalled Macleod saying,
"It is worth trying. Negative results would be of great physiological value."
To ensure Banting had heard him, he repeated the last statement 2 more times. Banting was disappointed at Macleod's pessimism. Banting's goal was to capture the mystery substance, not to prove that there was nothing to find. He felt slighted that Macleod assumed the results would be negative. Nevertheless, Macleod did agree to have Banting work on his hypothesis at his lab. He assigned Charles Best, one of Macleod's research assistants who had just graduated from the physiology and biochemistry course, to assist Banting over the summer. Banting recalled that Macleod did not have high hopes for the project when the professor told Best,
"It will likely all go up in smoke, but would be a good operative training, and we must leave no sod unturned."
Macleod then left to take some time off in Scotland, leaving Banting and Best to begin their project in late spring 1921. The pair worked through the hot summer months on their animal experiments. And it turned out to be quite a memorable summer. Probably one of the most momentous months in the history of medical discovery. Their extracts were showing very encouraging results. Banting could barely contain himself when he wrote to Macleod,
"Dear Professor Macleod, I have so much to tell you and ask you about that I scarcely know where to begin. I think you will be pleased when you see how the problem is unrolling from one end and rolling out the other. At present, I can honestly state my opinion that 1. The extract invariably causes a decrease in the percentage of the blood sugar and in the excretion of sugar in diabetic dogs."
In the same letter, Banting mentioned that he and Best called the extract iletin. Charles Best wrote a more matter-of-fact, somewhat subdued-sounding letter to Macleod. A snippet of the letter read,
"The extracts seem to have a marked effect. Our most convincing experiment is the record of dog 408. The whole of the large chart is devoted to this dog."
Macleod was pleased, perhaps surprised with Banting and Best's progress in his lab. Their work continued, but there were still many obstacles and challenges, including improving the purity of the pancreatic extracts and reducing infections in the test animals. But by the fall of the same year, they were certain they were on the right track. Best later wrote,
"The work during the fall months reported in our 2 papers were performed entirely by Banting and myself. We had the benefit of Dr. Macleod's advice, but as he states, we were given the opportunity to conclusively prove the efficiency of our extract upon diabetic animals."
J.B. Collip, a well-published associate professor of biochemistry at the University of Alberta, joined the team in December 1921. His task was to further refine the chemical processes to increase the purity of the extracts. By this time, friction between Banting and Macleod was building. Banting claimed that Macleod refused to provide more resources to the experiments and implied that the professor seemed to be claiming more credit than he deserved.
It must be remembered that at this time Professor Macleod had not done one single experiment, nor had he contributed one idea of value except estimation of hemoglobin before and after extract,
he reported later. Confident that their extract would prove effective, Banting was anxious to start testing the extract on humans. We will get back to the 13-year-old boy in Ward H shortly. You probably assumed that he was the first human to be given the extract. Well, strictly speaking, he wasn't. That distinction went to one of Banting's classmates, Joe Gilchrist. Diagnosed with diabetes in 1917, he had also been on the Allen starvation diet but was worsening rapidly. On December 20th, Banting gave him an oral dose of the extract. It did not help. The extract was meant to be injected, not taken orally. Banting probably knew it wouldn't work, but he had to try and help a friend. A few weeks later, on January 11th, 1922, using an extract prepared by Banting and Best, Leonard Thompson received 2 injections. 7.5 cc's of a brown, murky, sediment-filled fluid labeled Macleod's serum. The results were far from miraculous. His glucose level dropped a modest 25%, and his urine still contained ketones. To make matters worse, Leonard developed an abscess at the injection site on the left buttock, presumably due to impurities in the extract. Despite this discouraging turn of events, a newspaper article reported,
It was only a day or two ago that the first injection of extracts was given to a human being. It was as a last resort that permission was granted to the Toronto research men to experiment with this boy. So encouraging was the first treatment, it is announced, that these will be continued every day.
Fortunately, Collip came up with a process that refined the extraction process and greatly reduced the amount of impurities. On January 23, 1922, Leonard received the extract Collip prepared. This time, the glucose level dropped 76%, and the ketones in the urine disappeared. He gained energy and strength, a literal reanimation from near death. It worked. Convincingly. Miraculously. It was a scene that would be replayed over and over and over as this sensational new drug reignited hope for countless diabetic patients. The literature would soon be filled with heartwarming success story after success story. More than 40 years after Dr. Campbell first treated Leonard Thompson, he asked a medical resident how many diabetic coma cases the young doctor had seen. "None," the resident answered. The story of insulin is much more complicated than this brief podcast can tell. It's truly worthy of a cinematic epic. There were controversies about proper credit, mistrust, conspiracy theories, bitterness, and the well-documented fierce disagreements on who rightfully deserved the eventual Nobel Prizes. What is not in dispute is the immeasurable impact the discovery has made to not just prolong a life, but to improve the quality of that same life. Just as it did for Leonard Thompson. He was discharged from the hospital on May 15, 1922. He was by no means cured, and in fact, his diabetes remained very difficult to control. His tendency to live it up on weekends probably did not help. Eventually, his insulin was bumped up gradually to 85 units a day. He lived a decade more than he was expected to. He worked in a chemical factory and had as normal a life as he could have hoped for. Leonard passed away on April 20th, 1935, at the same hospital where he received a new lease on life. He succumbed to influenza complicated by pneumonia and diabetic ketoacidosis. That was 13 years after doctors said he was in a terminal state. In a poignant epilogue to Leonard's story, historian Michael Bliss recounted in his book, The Discovery of Insulin, the encounter between Banting and the medical student who performed the autopsy on Leonard.
Did he have any fun?
Yes, he had some fun. He used to get drunk nearly every weekend.
Well, I'm glad he had some fun.
Banting must have been smiling. That concludes this week's episode of Medisagas. We hope you found today's journey both captivating and enlightening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing as well as leaving a review on your preferred platform. Also, consider becoming a patron of this podcast. Come visit the website and send us your comments, suggestions, or ideas for stories that you want featured in future podcasts. We always appreciate your feedback and support. Thank you.